Today we're going to be learning Taanit Daf Kafav. Today's daf is sponsored by Jerry Goldstein Gedalia in loving memory of her mother, Helen Sape, Tzipi Hindabat Avraham Udvora Draza on her Shloshim. And today's daf is also sponsored by David and Yael Eichin on behalf of their daughter's first birthday. Mazal tov to our wonderful daughter, Ma'ayan Rachel. 1 year ago today, you joined us in this world on the eve of the 9th day of Hanukkah, as we now call it. This past year has been a journey of so much joy, awe to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, amazement, fun, and exhaustion. Even while you were still in my tummy, you got to hear Shiurim from Michelle. And in the first few months after you were born, we learned the daf together. May Torah be a guide to you and Derech Eretz, your way of life. We love you. We're immensely happy to be your parents. Thank you, Michelle Farber, for your amazing work. Okay, with that, we were going to talk about the Siyum. The Siyum is Be'ezrat Hashem on Sunday. The registration is up. Zoom Siyum as usual on Sunday. Anyone who's in Israel, there's Siyumim going on around. All are in Hebrew except for the one in Ranana, which will be in English on Monday morning at 8:15, if anybody wants to join. And we're excited that last night we started another skills class to teach people Gemara learning. That started in Hebrew. This month it will be in Hebrew. 4 Sugyot on Tikkun Olam with Rabbanit Dreyfus. It's a project that's in collaboration with Yeshivat Risha in Israel. Very excited about it. The same course I will be offering in the month of February, on Sundays in February. And we're excited to announce that before that, we're going to have a real beginners course. That course is relevant for beginners, but it doesn't start with the basics. It's basically one of those, jump in, dive in, and we'll learn as we go along. But we're going to have a pre-course for that in the month of January, on Sundays in January, with Leah Sarna, Rabbanit Leah Sarna, who's going to give a intro for more geared toward real beginners to Gemara. So all that information will be publicized within the next week or so. Okay. So a lot of exciting things going on, as well as our siyums that we're having every month. So, which you should enjoy now, because when we get to Seder Nashim, it's not going to be every month anymore. Okay, starting with our daf. Starting with the end of Kaf He Amud Bet and moving into, we're going to get into the 4th chapter today of Taanit, our 4th and last chapter. Ma'aseh v'gazru Taanit belod. And the Mishnah had explained that there was a time where they had a Taanit in Lod. We had this whole discussion at the end of yesterday's daf. And by the way, there's also a sheet for today, because we're back to normal Gemara with charts and all that, after all those long Agadatot. So there was a case we talked yesterday about at what point in the day do we stop the fast if the rains come. So we said there were 3 different opinions. This opinion in the Mishnah about this Taanit in Lod was before midday, it started to rain, and then they ended the fast, they ate, and then they went to, they said Hallel, okay, in praise and thanks to God. So now the Gemara asks a very basic question. Imagine you're standing in a fast day, it starts to rain. The first thing you do is eat, and then you praise God. Shouldn't we praise God first and then eat? So Abai v'Rava d'Amrei Tzravayu, right? These two people who fight and argue all the time. In this case, they agree, right? It's not the only case they agree. There are a lot of cases where they do agree, but here they're pointing out they both agree that what? It's a very interesting idea. You can only say Hallel on a full stomach and a kind of satisfied soul. Okay, you have to be in a good place to be able to think. So if you're fasting and starving, then you shouldn't say Hallel. You might ask, well, we always say Hallel in the morning when we daven before we eat. So if you have to be on a full stomach, well, you're not really on a full stomach. But I think there's a distinction made between in the morning and later in the day when you've already been fasting for a number of hours. So we don't want you in a bad state when you're saying Hallel. That's one possible reason. Rashi says it's actually because it says, Noten lechem l'chol basal, God provides food, bread for everybody, which, by the way, is not in our Hallel. Where is it? It's in what we call Hallel Agadol, Hodu Lashem Kitov Kilalam Chasto, which we say on Shabbat mornings, and we say it's the Seder, and it could be that that's what they're referring to in general. It's Hallel Agadol. It's not what we call Hallel. Okay, so because it says God gives bread, you want to be in a place where you're satiated and not when you're starving, and then you're saying, well, God gives bread, but I don't have any bread now. I haven't eaten in hours. So it'd be more, you can say it with wholeheartedly, I would say. So now the Gemara says, Ini, is that really true? The Harav Papa, Iglalabe Knishta, the Avi Gover. He came to the shul that was called Avi Gober. Okay, you happened to come to a place. It was the shul there, which comes up a bunch of times in the Gemara. B'gazav Taanit. Okay, Rashi says it's either Shem Adam or Shem Makom. Okay, we don't really know what Avi Guber is. It sounds like a person's name, Avi Guber, but maybe it was the name of a place. And anyway, there was no rain. He instituted a fast. V'yardu lahem kshamim ad chatzot. And before midday, rains came. Ve'amar halel. Achar kach achlu v'shatu. They said halal, and then they ate and drank. So here you see the order was the opposite. Didn't we just say you have to eat on a full stomach? Well, Shani b'nei mechozeh d'shchichei b'hu shichrut. Okay, we're going to start our daf with drunkenness. We're going to end our daf with drunkenness. These were people in mechozeh who often got drunk. And because they got drunk, they basically said, well, we don't want you to eat because then you'll forget or you'll say halal when you're drunk, which we don't want. You're not supposed to daven when you're drunk. It's not appropriate. So therefore, they basically said, this is an exception to the rule. This is one of those cases where on the one hand, you want to do something like say halal on a full stomach. On the other hand, we don't want you to say it drunk. So in this case, they basically said halal first. And with that, Hadron alach seder taniyot elu, and we will start the fourth chapter. As in the second and the third chapter, we had all the Mishnayot in the beginning, which complicates things a little bit because we're going to read a lot of things that we're not going to fully understand, and we'll have to wait a while. Usually, you have a Mishnah, you don't understand something, you get to it right away in the Gemara, at least maybe the next day. But here, right, we're going to have all the Mishnayot at once, raise a lot of questions, and we'll see hopefully answers to at least some of our questions when we get to the Gemara. This is one of those classic Mishnayot that likes to give everything in numbers. But we're going to see that the numbers here are a little bit complicated because they're not really accurate. And that's going to be the Gemara's first question. 3 times a year, the Kohanim do Birkat Kohanim, right? What we call duchening, or right, the blessing of the Kohanim. The Kohanim bless the people 4 times a day. So there's 3 times a year where they do it 4 times a day. Where did they do it 4 times a day? B'shacharit, in the morning prayer, b'musaf, in the additional prayer, b'mincha, in the afternoon prayer, and b'ni'ilat sha'arim. Okay, we're now going to learn that ni'ilat sha'arim, and maybe that's the main thing the Mishnah is trying to teach us, is that there's a prayer called ni'ilah, which we say multiple times a year. We don't say it, right? When do we say ni'ilah? Normally we say ni'ilah when? Once a year, on Yom Kippur. And in fact, Daphne Shalahen talks about this whole idea of Ni'ilah and why it's now only once a year. But Ni'ilah used to be 3 times a year. Okay, and we're going to see why the other ones aren't relevant, because one is Ta'aniyot, okay, which is we're now going to see Be'Ta'aniyot, Be'Mamadot, U'B'Yom Kippurim. Okay, so it's Ta'aniyot, Mamadot, Yom Kippurim. These are 3 times a year where they said Ni'ilah, and not only did they say Ni'ilah, but the Kohanim duchen 4 times a day. Problem number 1 is not all these days have musaf. So it's a little bit strange about this musaf thing, why it says 4 times a day when musaf is only said on Yom Kippur out of all these days. So that's a little bit strange. And the Gemara is going to ask that question when we get there. But now let's talk about what these things are. Ta'aniyot, we mean Ta'aniyot Tzibor, public fast, the ones we've been discussing all along. Mamadot, we're going to read about it in another minute. Is actually, let me wait and we'll read it inside in the Mishnah, what exactly Mamadot were, and Yom Kippur, which we know, we say Tfilah Ni'ilah, right? It's a prayer we say at the very end of Yom Kippur. Everybody knows about that. So now it's saying, Elohein Mamadot. This is what the Mamadot are. Lefi shene'emal, Savit b'nei Yisrael et korbani lachmi. Command the Jewish people that they should bring my sacrifices. What is this referring to? It's a pasuk that's referring to the daily korban tamid. But how could it make sense that we're all obligated to bring a sacrifice? Now, what's the problem? Who brings the sacrifice? The Kohanim that are in charge that week. They take care of the sacrifice. What do? We're sitting in our houses doing nothing. So therefore, they said, how could it be that there's a sacrifice being brought for us and we're just sitting in our houses doing nothing? It doesn't make any sense. So the Nevi'im HaRishonim, which the commentaries claim is David and Shlomo, instituted 24 mishmarot, rotations. Al kol mishmar u'mishmar haya ma'ama b'Yerushalayim shel Kohanim v'shel Leviyim v'shel Yisraelim. Each rotation consisted of Kohanim, Leviyim, and Yisraelim. Okay, what would happen? Higiyah zman ha'mishmar la'alot, when it was your turn, Kohanim u'Leviyim olim Yerushalayim. So the Kohanim go to do their work for that week. Right? We've already learned about the 24 Mishmarot Kuna, so twice a year, plus on the holidays, they would come. Then the Leviyim would have to do their thing. They sung and they did some other things in the temple. They would all go to Yerushalayim. V'Yisrael shaboto mishmar mitkansim la'areihem. Then there were Israelites. Now, some people say it was just Israelim. Some people say there were also Kohanim and Leviyim that were part of this, but this is what we call the Ma'amadot. They were people who gathered together in their cities, and whoever was in Yerushalayim, it doesn't say so in the Mishnah, but it says in other places, would go to the temple. They would stand by the temple, and they would pray that the korbanot would be received. Okay, so they had a whole set of prayers. When we get to Masechet Tamid in another few years, we'll learn what the prayers were of the Ma'amadot, and it's like one of the earliest forms of prayer that existed. Because in the time of the temple, there wasn't really prayer, but this was prayer that existed in the time of the temple. The Mishnah dates it all the way back to David and Shlomo. If you go by the Nevi'im Rishonim were David and Shlomo, which is very early. I don't know historically what's really accurate about it, but the Mishnah seems to say it started way back then. There was at least some form of Jews that were in charge of some sort of prayer for that. And now we find out that not only did they pray, but Korim b'Maaseh Bereshit. What Torah reading did they do? The assumption is when Jews get together to pray, they also read from the Torah. So they would read from the Torah every day, not like we do on Mondays and Thursdays. But these people who gathered together had a special prayer they would say, and they would read from the Torah, and they would read from the creation of the world. So now we're going to assume the obvious. Okay, if you're going to read from the creation of the world for the week that you're on a Ma'amad, so what do? You read every day, that day of creation. But we're now going to see that it didn't exactly work that way. Before we get to that, we're going to read this section that's in parentheses, which really doesn't belong in the Mishnah, but I'm going to read it anyway, because whether it belongs in the Mishnah or not is a question, but it seems like it's probably true, even if it wasn't in the Mishnah. We'll see from the end of the daf why it seems clear that this was true. They would fast on, right? It wasn't just that they prayed, they also fasted, but they only fasted 4 of the days of the week. Why? Miyom Sheni v'ad Yom Chamishi, Monday to Thursday, not Sunday and not Friday. Lo hayu mitanim erev Shabbat mipnei kvod Shabbat. They didn't fast on erev Shabbat because you didn't want to go in to Shabbat fasting. That's why we don't generally have fasts on Fridays. Once in a while, it ends up that way. I think that the only one is the 10th of Tevet, if I'm not mistaken, which is coming up next week. And v'lo be'echad b'Shabbat k'dei shelo yitzu mimenucha v'oneg l'yia v'Taanit v'yamutu. And not on Sunday, because we don't want you to go stark contrast from Shabbat of eating and drinking and having a good time to all of a sudden not eating at all, and you might even die. Okay, that's a bit extreme that one would die from such a thing, but the idea is, we basically minimize fasts right after Shabbat. The Yom HaRishon, now we're going to see what they read. You could see why this section is, even if it did belong in the Mishnah, it's definitely out of place because they were talking a minute ago about the Torah reading, and this is a continuation about the Torah reading. B'Yom HaRishon Bereshit v'Yehi Rakia. On the first day, they would read what happened on the first day of creation and what happened on the second day of creation. By the way, there's a bit of an intro to Megillah, because besides Megillah talking about reading the Megillah and Purim, it also discusses Torah readings on what days and all sorts of rules about Torah readings. And this is an important rule about a Torah reading that you need to know, which is you need 3 people to go up to get an aliyah on a regular day, right? Also on a fast day or a ma'amad. So you would need 3 olim. Now, if you need 3 olim, minimum, you have to read 3 psukim. So you need a minimum of 9 psukim. And if we just went by the creation of the world each day, you wouldn't have enough psukim. And therefore, they would do 2 sections every day. So day number 1, they would read what was created on Sunday and Monday. Day number 2, Monday, Tuesday. Day number 3, Tuesday and Thursday. And that's what we're going to read right now. So the first day, Bereshit, first day, and Yehi Rakia, which is day number 2. Right, the skies, and the B'Sheni Yehi Rakia v'Yikavu Hamayim. B'Shlishi Yikavu Hamayim v'Yehi Ma'orot. Okay, I'm just going to read through this. This is basically just what we read on each of the days, that day and the next day. B'Revi'i Yehi Ma'orot v'Yishretzu Hamayim. B'Chamishi Yishretzu Hamayim v'Totzei Haaretz. B'Shishi v'Totzei Haaretz v'Yichulu Hashamayim. Okay, right. There is an option where you could just repeat the same thing, which does happen on some days, but for some reason they don't suggest that. Parsha Gdola, Korin Ota b'Shnayim, B'Ktana b'Yachid. Now notice they're not doing 3 every day, because if they did 3, it would be very easy. First, right, each aliyah has a different day. But here we have 2 days with 3 aliyot. So how do you split it? So they say the ones that are longer, that have more psukim, you split in 2. And the day that's shorter, right? Some of them at least have, 3 psukim and some have 5. We're actually going to have to figure out what if it has 5. How do you split it in 2? We'll get to some of these issues in the Gemara. Now there's a strange line, and this is a classic, right? Everyone always complains there's no punctuation in the Gemara. So without punctuation, it can lead to questionable explanations. So now this says the next 3 words are b'shacharit, b'musaf, u'b'mincha. Okay, in shacharit, in musaf, and in mincha. Now what it says here is nichnesim v'korin al pihem kekorin et shema. They don't actually read from the Torah. They read it by heart, the same way they read Shema. Okay, Shema, they didn't read from a Sefer Torah. Every time you say Shema, you don't open a Sefer Torah. So they would read it like they read Shema. Now, the assumption is that in 1 or 2 of the tefillot, they read it from a Torah. And in other tefillot, they read it by heart. They didn't take out a whole Torah. They just said it by heart. So now it's unclear where you punctuate. Is b'shacharit referring back? In other words, what we said already, they read from the Torah was shacharit. B'musaf or b'mincha, in musaf and mincha, they would say it by heart. Or is it b'shacharit b'musaf? Now you would think it would have a vav if that were the case, and in musaf. But some people read it as, and we'll see the Gemara has this question, which is b'shacharit b'musaf, you do it the way we described with the Sefer Torah. Ubimincha, but and in mincha, the laws are different, and you read it by heart. So it's very unclear how to read this. Okay, next. You have to remember, by the way, just to give you a historical perspective, the Mishnah is put together around the year 200 by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. There's no longer a temple in place. So the whole issue of the Ma'amadot is no longer happening in their time. So all their descriptions are describing something that was no longer existing. Okay, next. Erev Shabbat b'mincha, is that we're up to? Yes. Erev Shabbat b'mincha lo hayu nechnesim mishum b'pnei kvod Shabbat. The Ma'amadot wouldn't get together to do these special prayers on Erev Shabbat in mincha. Why? Because of kvod Shabbat. Okay, because people were getting ready for Shabbat. So because they were busy getting ready for Shabbat, therefore they didn't have time to do a long davening. I see you're pointing out that there's, I just want to look here. The hay. Yeah. So if you look at the hay, by the word musaf, if you're using a regular Gemara, there's a little note, hey, there's a little letter there, which leads you to Hagahot B'Tziyunim, which are notes. And it says, Sarich Lamar Uvim Musaf. So some of the versions of the text of the Mishnah actually said, and in Musaf, which would then relate to the problem I was addressing before. Okay, moving, but still, it still wouldn't be clear how to read it. Uve Musaf doesn't help you because Shacharit Uve Musaf and then Uve Mincha, or it still could be B'Shacharit and then Uve Musaf Uve Mincha. Right? It still doesn't help with punctuation, but it does help a little bit. Okay, next. Korban, now we're going to have all sorts of days. We just said right now on Erev Shabbat and Mincha, the Ma'amadot didn't do their special prayers because there wasn't enough time. People were busy getting ready for Shabbat. We're now going to see other days that there wasn't enough time and they wouldn't do all their prayers either. Kol yom sheyesh bo halel em ma'amad b'shacharit. If there's halel, then in the morning prayer, they don't do the ma'amad. Okay, some people even think for the rest of the day as well, not just in shacharit. Some people think there's a lot of lack of clarity here. Some people think it's only the people that were in Jerusalem, because the ones in Jerusalem, not only did they pray for the sacrifice, but they also helped with certain things. They would bring water and wood and things that were needed. So they had a lot of things to do and didn't have enough time. Because you would think Hallel is not that long, that it should take so much time that they don't do their prayers. But on the other hand, they did have to get to work probably at a certain point. So one can understand, we're going to get to that whole thing of Torah Chatzibur and how many aliyot and all that comes up in Megillah about trying to shorten davening some days so that people can get to work. So it could make sense. So on a day where there's Hallel, some of the commentators say this could only be referring to Hanukkah, because Rosh Chodesh, Hallel wasn't a chiyuv like it is. That's why we say half Hallel, we call it, even though it's not really half. But on Rosh Chodesh, we skip 2 paragraphs. It's to distinguish Hallel on Rosh Chodesh from all the others, because it's not an obligation like it is on all the others. It's a custom. Some people actually don't even say the bracha on Rosh Chodesh. There's a machloket about that. So now they say if there's Hallel, which they seem to mean Hanukkah, because also on Hallel when there's Musaf, that's already the next one we're going to discuss. And most of the other days where there's Hallel are holidays, right? Chagim mamash. Okay, so then things will be different. But anyway, kol yom sheyesh bo Hallel ema ama b'shacharit. Okay, in other words, there is no other time where there's Hallel and not Musaf. Chol Hamoed, there's always Musaf. So when there's Hallel, you don't have a mamad and shacharit. If there's korban musaf, if there's Musaf, ein b'ne'ilah. Okay, I see you're pointing out about Rosh Chodesh Chanukah, we say Hallel Shalem, that's because it's Chanukah, not because it's Rosh Chodesh. Okay, next. Korban Musaf ein b'ne'ilah. So if there's Korban Musaf that day, then you don't say it in Ne'ilah. And most people say not even in all of the prayers, even Ne'ilah, they want to say. Okay, meaning even though, right, it's just Musaf is extra, but then we just cut off the additional prayers of the Ma'amadot in all of the prayers of that day. It's a little bit unclear, like I said, how to read most of these sections here. Korban Eitzim ein b'mincha. If there's Korban Eitzim, what is Korban Eitzim? So there were people who would volunteer. We talked about this before with Sna'ad bin Binyamin. If you remember, they had a special day on the 10th of Av. And once it came out, the Tisha B'Av was on their special day and the whole thing, did they fast all day or not? So there were people who volunteered to bring Eitzim to the temple. And it seems they would also bring a korban. It's unclear exactly whether they brought a korban of wood, that they would burn some wood on the altar. That was their korban, or they would bring some other korban because of it. But on those days, they wouldn't do the special prayers of the ma'amad in mincha. There's also a debate. Are we talking about only if you were in the ma'amad and it was your korban eitzim, it was your family that was doing it? Or on that day, does it affect everybody, even though it's more of like a personal holiday for these people? It wasn't a holiday for everyone, but maybe it was a good enough reason not to say the extra prayers of the ma'amad. It's not so clear. Amar lo ben Azai, kachaya Rabbi Yeshua shoneh. Korban Musa, okay, he says, no. Rabbi Yeshua had a different version than you. And I charted this out so you can see. Korban Musaf ein b'mincha, Korban Eitzim ein b'ne'ilah. Okay, if there's Korban Musaf, then they wouldn't say it in mincha, not b'ne'ilah, not in mincha, which means you would say it in ne'ilah. And Korban Eitzim ein b'ne'ilah. If there's Korban Eitzim, then you don't do it in ne'ilah. Okay, he had it flipped. We don't really understand the difference, why each one says what yet. In the end, once Ben Azai says this is the way Rabbi Yeshua would say it, Rabbi Akiva is convinced and he goes with his opinion. Okay, the Eitzim of the Kohanim and the Am, because sometimes it was Kohanim who brought, sometimes it was the nation. There were 9 days a year where people volunteered to bring wood to the temple. This started, by the way, in the second temple time period, when in the beginning of them, they didn't have enough wood and they needed people to volunteer wood. I'm going to raise a question here that I don't have an answer to, which is, if I would say 9 days a year, you would assume that we're going to evenly distribute those 9 days throughout the year. You're going to see not only is it not evenly distributed, but it's very, very heavily concentrated in a certain time of year. Don't know why that is, but I'll raise it as a question. I'll kind of mention one possible way of understanding it, but I don't know. I didn't look ahead in the Gemara to see if the Gemara addresses it. I don't know, but I definitely didn't see commentaries address it here from the few that I looked at. Okay, so now it says, these are the 9 days, and now we're going to see who brought them each time. Be'echad b'Nisan b'nei Arach ben Yehuda. Okay, so in the first of Nisan, it was Arach ben Yehuda. Ben Yehuda is not that his father was Yehuda, but he came from the tribe of Yehuda. Be'esrim b'Tammuz, okay, we're skipping a good chunk of months. Okay, we're going from the first of Nisan to the 20th of Tammuz. B'nei David ben Yehuda. So some of the commentaries there say it's because they brought a lot. And maybe that's what you'd have to say the answer is. Whoever had a lot brought a lot, and therefore we had X amount of time to get to the next one. And then there were people who didn't have a lot, but they brought a little bit in, but we'll see that some of them go for like 2 days or something. So it's a little bit weird. B'chamisha b'Av. Okay, now we're going from the 20th of Tammuz to the 5th of Av. That's about 3 weeks. Okay. B'nei Parosh ben Yehuda. B'Shiv'abo, okay, skip 2 more days on the 7th of Av, B'nei Yonadav ben Rechav. Ba'asarabo, skip 3 more days, B'nei Sna'ah ben Binyamin. So here in Av, we're going to have a lot, which we're not even done yet. B'chamisha asarbo, on the 15th of Av, B'nei Zatu ben Yehuda, V'imahem, and not only that, but they would add all these other people, Kohanim, Leviim, V'chomish Ta'ah b'Shivto, Anyone who knows they belong to one of these families, but they're not sure which one, so they will bring it on that day. And B'nai Gonvei Eli B'nai Kotzei Ktsio. We're going to have to see the Gemara, but these are people that aren't exactly the best of people. Gonvei, they steal this Eli, which is the part of the mourner in Pesel. B'nai Kotzei Ktsio, they cut figs. We're going to see what all this is later in the Gemara. And Be'esrim Bo B'nai Pachat Moav Ben Yehuda, the 20th of Av. Okay, so we have a huge number of people bringing in the month of Av. I don't know the reason for that. Be'esrim Be'elul B'nai Adim Ben Yehuda, on the 20th of Elul, sons of Adim Ben Yehuda. So we skip only another month. Okay, we're still very close in the calendar. And then we jump from Elul to Tevet. Okay, Be'echad B'Tevet, Shavu B'nai Parosh Shniya. Now we needed a repeat, so B'nai Parosh brings it a second time. Now we see something about a Chab Tevet. Okay, Becky, you mentioned the Chab Tevet is this unique day. So now they're going to point out, Lo ayabo ma'amad, shayabo halel, v'korban musaf, v'korban etzim. Okay, it had a lot of things going on. It had the ma'amad, it had halel, it had korban musaf, and the korban etzim. Okay, this is, by the way, my husband always loves to quote. There was this academic article once about called Mrs. Cooperman Shabbos, which is these women who go to shul and they basically read the siddur from start to finish, right? They don't understand that they're supposed to skip certain things on certain days. And Rosh Chodesh Tevet, okay, this year it wasn't a Chab Tevet, it was the day before, it was the 30th, it was the last day of the month, where basically you can read everything because you have Ya'alev Yafo, you have Alanisim, basically read straight through. Obviously, it's a bit of a joke because you don't actually, right, you don't say Alanisim also on Purim, but it's this concept of the everything Shabbos. So that's what they're pointing out here. Now we're moving on. And now we're getting to, you would have expected we would have gotten here. We've been 26 dapim into this Masechet of Masechet Taanit. You would have expected to talk about the regular fast, Tisha B'Av, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, all the others. So now they tell us this very famous Mishnah. There's 5 things that happen on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and 5 things on Tisha B'Av. Here we go. Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, there's a debate about whether these are listed in chronological order. They seem to be, but there's a bit of a debate about some of these things, what exactly they are. Nishtabru haluchot. So this obviously was the first thing that happened in history on the 17th of Tammuz, where the tablets were broken. Batel hatamid. Okay, the Tamid sacrifice was canceled. So what does that mean? That means that there's a debate about exactly what this is. Rashi says here, the Romans stopped letting us do the Korban Tamid sometime before the end of the Second Temple period of time. And at a certain point, they stopped bringing it. Some people say that there was a siege on the city and they would have to ask the Romans to bring them the kvasim every day, the lambs for sacrifice. And one day they brought them pigs, and from then they stopped bringing it. That's another midrash about it. Saraf apostimos, huvka'a ha'ir. Okay, the city was destroyed. This is before the destruction, right? Where they basically, this is in the first temple time period, which is also, it's a little tricky, is Batela Tamid in the first or the second. So that was what happened on Shabbos Tammuz. Saraf apostimus tatorah. The Torah was burned by Apostomus. Who is Apostomus? So first of all, the root of the name is posthumus. Some people say it was that his father died before he was born, and that's why he was called posthumous. Unclear. Anyway, it's not clear what time he lived. Okay, some people say it was a Greek officer, and he burned the Torah. Now, how to read this again is a little bit of a little bit, how do you read this? Who's it referring to? Did someone, no, it's one of our enemies, put what do you call it, an idol in the Heichal of the temple? Or is it Apostomus burnt the Torah and then put an idol in the Heichal? It's not clear. Okay, the first thing that happened historically was in the time of the desert, in the Cheder Meraglim, when the spies were punished. Right, the people cried, and then the Midrash says, right, you cried, now I'll give you a real reason to cry, and I'll burn it, right, that the temple will be burnt on that day. So it seems the night that it was decreed that they weren't going to go into the land because of the sin of the spies was Tisha B'Av. Both first and second temple were destroyed. Right, thank you. I forgot that, Leah. That Menashe, some people say it was Menashe, the king of Yehuda, one of the last Judean, toward the end of Sefer Melachim, not the very end, but one of the last kings that was pretty bad, that they put a tselem in the Hechal, which would just be strange if you say that, because it's a hard commentary, because then it's happening in the beginning of right at the end of the first temple time period, and things are really not chronological. But again, that's one of the issues about whether it's chronological or not, whether you could say that that's who put the tselem in the Hechal, or whether it's talking about some later time in the second temple time period, which would then be more the Greeks or the Romans. Okay, moving back to Tisha B'Av. We have the last two things. Nilkita Beital. Okay, Beitar was captured. That's in the Bar Kokhba rebellion after the destruction. Right here, it's more in historical order. And Nechresha Ha'ir, and then the city is plowed through, like it's kind of just entirely destroyed, which happened later. Mishnichnas Av, or at least it happened after the destruction of the temple. Not clear whether it happened before Beitar or after. Mishnichnas Av Mima'atim B'Simcha. When Av comes in, we limit our happiness. This is the opposite of Mishnichnas Adar Marbim B'Simcha, right? These are two opposite months. We start to, and this is the laws basically, or the beginning of the laws of what we call the 9 days. Okay, and you're going to see the 9 days. You're going to see what we call Shavua Shechalbo, the week that Tisha B'Av falls. And right before Tisha B'Av starts, towards like the end of the day on Erev Tisha B'Av. So the first thing it just says, we limit simcha. It doesn't exactly tell you what the rules are, what you can or can't do. Shabbat shechal Tisha B'Av li'opetucha, the week of Tisha B'Av, meaning from Sunday till whenever Tisha B'Av is, says asur milesaper u'milechabes. Notice, by the way, we don't take haircuts for the 3 weeks, okay? But in the Mishnah, it just says from the week of Tisha B'Av. Okay, and this is why some people are more careful about things specifically in the week of Tisha B'Av, less than the 9 days, because there is this distinction in the Mishnah. So you can't cut your hair and you can't wash your clothes. On Thursday, you can because of Kvod Shabbat. However, yes, like the Sfaradim, exactly. The Sfaradim don't have this idea of the 3 weeks. They don't even have, as far as I know, the 9 days, or maybe they have a little bit of the 9 days, but it's mostly the Shavua Shechalbo. And that's what you see from here. And Shabbat, this seems to be referring to when Tisha B'Av falls on a Friday, which nowadays never happens, and that's why you might say, oh, I never heard this before. If Tisha B'Av falls on Friday and you want clean clothes for Shabbat, then you're allowed to wash your clothes on Thursday, because Shabbat will already be past the 9 days. Erev Tisha B'Av lo yochal adam ad shnei tavshilim. We don't mean Erev Tisha B'Av the whole day. What we mean is for the last meal before Tisha B'Av. This is why many people eat an egg, right? Eggs, because eggs is one cooked dish. You can't eat 2 cooked things right before Tisha B'Av. It's the opposite of Yom Kippur, where you have a big festive meal before. Here, we're supposed to limit how much we eat. Lo yochal basar v'lo yishteh yain. You shouldn't eat meat and you shouldn't drink wine, which again, right, we don't do for the 9 days. But here it seems like it's only in that last meal before Tisha B'Av. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer yishaneh. One should change. Okay, we don't yet know what this means. Rashi tells us, wait till the Gemara will explain. Rabbi Yehuda he would obligate people to turn over their beds. V'lo hodu lo chachamim, but the rabbis did not agree with him that this was necessary. Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, lo ayu yomim tovim liYisrael kechamisha asar b'av u'kiyom kippurim. Okay, there were these special days. There were no good days, right? There was like these are the happiest days of the year. What are they? Tisha B'Av and Tu B'Av. Okay, the 15th of Av and Yom Kippurim. Okay, now we're going to learn about Tu B'Av. There's a bit of you can look at Read Flashback this week. Shuli Mishka wrote about this specifically, about Tu B'Av. It's a very strange day in the Jewish calendar. Like, where does this come from? So for more, you can read on our homepage. You can find it from Shuli Mishkin. It says, Lo ayu yomim of the, right, these were the best days of the year. Shebahen benot Yerushalayim yotzot b'klei lavan she'ulim. So the girls of Jerusalem would go out, the young women in Jerusalem would go out wearing borrowed white clothing. Why borrowed? Shelo levayesh et mi she'en lo, so as not to embarrass anyone who didn't have. So therefore, everyone wore something borrowed, so you couldn't tell who had, who didn't. Kol hakelim tu'unim tefillah. All the clothes the women wore, they would have to put in the mikvah first, because women wouldn't know if I was getting clothing from someone who was in nida, and then their clothes were tmeim. And this was in the time when people were careful about laws of impurity. Right now, it really is only relevant impure clothes is irrelevant to us. Just whether someone's in need or not, if she's menstruating, that's an issue for her with her relations with her husband. But the whole issue of clothing is not an issue anymore, but then it was. It seems very out of place, this whole thing about kol hakelim tunim tefillah, why they're telling us this. But anyway, they are. Now we get to what they did on that day. They would go out into the vineyards and dance. And what would they say? Right? All the young men look up and see, right? Look at all the beautiful women, or not, we'll see, not really beautiful, but they're trying to say, look at all the women and see what you're choosing. Don't look at their beauty. You would expect the end of that sentence to be something different, but yet here it says, but look at the family, okay? Which, again, maybe, I mean, in the time of the Mishnah, you think that really means yichus, right? It's all about yichus, like which family do you belong to and all that, which you think is not exactly so fair. But I think also family, like now you go to a shidduch, right? Or you ask about someone, you want to see, are they a good family? Are they good, right? And whether you call it shidduch or not shidduch, right? If your child is going out with someone, you want to find out what's the family like. That's just a normal, natural thing. So maybe that's what it means. And in fact, the continuation seems to be along those lines, because they quote the famous pasuk from Eshechayil, Sheker Achem Vehevel Yofi Isha Yirat Hashem Hi Titalel, right? It's not the Chen, it's not the Yofi, it's Yirat Hashem. You want to know. She come from a good family that has, as someone's saying, right, good shared values, all that. A woman who's God-fearing. In other words, what's it all about? You want people to be praising her for her good deeds. You want a good person. And now, what about Yom Kippur? Why was that a Yom Tov? So now we quote this pasuk from Shir HaShirim. Sena ure'ena benot Yitzion. That's where the famous Sena ure'ena book comes from, this pasuk. B'melech Shlomo, go look b'not Zion at the Melech Shlomo. Ba'atara she'itra lo imo b'yom chatunato b'yom simchat libo. It's interesting. First, the men are looking at the women. Here, it's the b'not Zion are looking at the men, at least at a man at the Melech Shlomo. Look at the atara that his mother made him, the crown that she made for him on the day of his wedding and the day of his simchat libo, the happiness of his heart. So what's b'yom chatunato b'yom simchat libo, and how does that relate to Yom Kippur? B'yom chatunato ze matan Torah. That's the day that the Torah was given, the wedding. Ub'yom simchat libo ze binyan beit hamikdash yibaneh b'meira b'yameinu. That's the day of the Beit Hamikdash, which will hopefully be rebuilt soon in our day. So now, what does that have to do with Yom Kippur? Matan Torah is Shavuot, and Yom Simchat Libo is the day the Beit Hamikdash was built. So what does that have to do with Yom Kippur? So Rashi says, Matan Torah, Yom Kippurim shenenu bo luchot ha'achronot. Okay, the second luchot were given on Yom Kippur, so therefore it's called Matan Torah, and that's where we see this reference to the fact that this is like a wedding, therefore a happy day. Notice both of these connect with the idea of a wedding, right? Those are the best days, right? You think back of your life. Those of us who are, I would say those of us who are happily married, right? You think of your wedding day as this very exciting day in your life. So there you have the Mishnah. That's how we end. It's a very interesting way to end this Masechet, right? It was all about fast days and sad days. And remember, we kept talking about that root Sa'al kept coming up. And yet we end with this big happiness and idea of weddings and happy days. So now the Gemara starts off with this first issue that I told you we're going to have an issue with. What do you mean 3 times a year we say Birkat Kohanim 4 times a day? There are no 4 prayers on those 3 days, only on one of them. So Taanit Mamadot Miika Musaf. Is there Musaf in Taanit Mamadot? So they answer Chisor V'Chasor V'Hachli Katan. It's one of those Mishnayot that's missing words, and this is how you should read it. B'shlosha prakim HaKohanim nosim et kapehem kol zman shemitpalalim. 3 times a year, the Kohanim say Birkat Kohanim every time that they daven. V'yesh mehen arba'a pamim b'yom. Sometimes it comes out 4 times in a day, which would be, right, Shacharit Musaf Mincha Nilat Sha'arim. Ve'elu hen shlosha prakim Taanit Mamadot b'Yom Kippurim. So basically, of these, you might end up with 4. Some others, you might end up with only 3. Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Ravua Zo Divrei Rabbi Meir. By the way, this is only Rabbi Meir. Aval Chachamim Omrim Shacharit u'Musaf yesh b'hem nesiat kapayim, mincha v'nila ein b'hem nesiat kapayim. According to Rabbi Meir, you only say Birkat Kohanim in Shacharit and Musaf, not in Ne'ilah and Mincha. And in a few minutes, we're going to see, or in a minute or two, we're going to see why there's a machloket here. And we're going to see right now, they say machloket Rabbi Meir and Chachamim, whether Rabbi Meir says all the prayers and Chachamim say only half, right? Only 2 out of 4. Then we're going to see a third opinion. So to get there, we're going to say man Chachamim. Who is this Chachamim's opinion? It's not actually everybody. It's really one person's opinion. And we're going to see it's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, he did Tanya, as we know from a Braita. And in the Braita, we're going to see 3 opinions. Did Tanya, as it says in a Braita, Shacharit u'musaf mincha u'nuila, kulam yesh b'hem nesiat kapayim divrei Rabbi Meir. All 4 prayers, you say Birkat Kohanim, we've done that. Rabbi Yehuda omer, Shacharit u'musaf yesh b'hem nesiat kapayim. Mincha v'nila ein b'hem nesiat kapayim. That's what we just said in the name of Chachamim. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi omer, Ne'ilah yesh b'hem nesiat kapayim, mincha ein b'hem nesiat kapayim. He has an in-between opinion. Yes to Ne'ilah, no to mincha, which, by the way, which is what we do on Yom Kippur. At least in my kila, we do this. There might be different customs, but we generally do Birkat Kohanim and Ne'ilah. As long as you get there before a certain time of day, you're allowed to do Birkat Kohanim. That's why there's always like a timing issue of Ne'ilah in Israel, where they do the duchening to finish Ne'ilah earlier so that you can say Birkat Kohanim still. And in Mincha, we don't do it. So now we're going to see why. What's the root of their machlok? Rabbi Meir Saval, Kol Yom Atama Lo Parse Kohanei Yadayo B'Minchata. Why don't they do it at Mincha every day? Because here we're talking only about fast days, Yom Kippur and the Ma'amat. But why don't we do it every day in Mincha Mishum Shichrut? Because of drunkenness. Ha'idna Leka Shichrut. We're worried the Kohanim will be drunk. They're not allowed to do Birkat Kohanim when they're drunk. We'll see at the end of the daf why that is. But there's an assumption right now they can't do Birkat Kohanim when they're drunk. We actually discussed it way back. But now, on these days, there's no concern they're going to be drunk. It's a fast day. And that goes with, I told you we get back to this, that the Ma'amadot, even though it didn't say in the Mishnah, it seems clear that in the Ma'amadot, they also fasted. Rabbi Yehuda Saval, Shacharit Musaf de Kol Yom Lo Shia Shechrut Lo Gazru Bu Rabbanan. But Mincha U'Nila de Kol Yom Shechrut Gazru Bu Rabbanan. They didn't want them to do Birkat Kohanim on a fast day in the afternoon because maybe people will mistake it and think the next day they can also do Birkat Kohanim in the afternoon. So they said anytime where there's a concern for drunkenness, even though today there isn't, we're going to basically not allow it. What about this in between? Rabbi Yossi savar mincha di'ita b'kol yom agazru b'Rabbanan. Well, mincha, we're worried you might confuse it with mincha tomorrow. But Ne'ilah, deleta b'chol yom agazru b'Rabbanan. But Ne'ilah only comes on fast days. So of course you could do it. There's no concern tomorrow. We'll think, oh, I could do it in mincha because I did it in Ne'ilah today. So therefore he thinks Ne'ilah, you can do it. So now we get to how we paskin, and we're going to see some different approaches here. Amar Rav Yudam, Rav halacha ki Rabbi Meir. First is to say halachas like Rabbi Meir, all the prayers you do Birkat Kohanim. Rabbi Yochanan Amar nahaguham ki Rabbi Meir. The people did like Rabbi Meir, but not necessarily that we hold that way. The Rav Amar minhag ki Rabbi Meir. Rav says the custom is like Rabbi Meir. So what's the difference between these 3 wordings? Manda Amar halacha ki Rabbi Meir dashina la b'pirka. We've seen things like this before. If you say the halachas like this, you teach that in the yeshivas or in the drashot or whenever they get up in shul, they teach it to everyone. Manda Amar minhag midrash lo dashinan uruya molina. If you say it's a minhag, then it means you don't teach it to everybody. But if they ask you, you tell them this is what we do. Umanda Amar nahagu. They say the people did this, Aruye lo molinan, you don't teach it. Even if someone asks you, you don't tell them that that's what we do. But but if they did it that way, then you leave it. It's okay. You don't have to start, saying, oh, redo davening. Rav Nachman Amal, but Rav Nachman says halakha ki Rabbi Yossi, and the Gemara says halakha ki Rabbi Yossi. As I said before, that's why we do it in the Ilah, we don't do it in Mincha. My time of pasek kahana yadayu b'minchata de Taanit. So nowadays, why, if we hold like Rabbi Yossi, why do people do Birkat Kohanim and Mincha on a fast day? Because they do Mincha and Taanit different from all other days, and this is a little bit strange why it's different about it. There's different opinions. Maybe Mincha normally they did earlier in the day, and on those days they did it later in the day because you could do Mincha earlier, you could do it later. Or Mincha on a fast also has Torah reading and Haftorah. So maybe they started at the same time and it just went later. So because of that, it has this feeling of like Ne'ilah, okay? And therefore, you can treat it like Ne'ilah. It's distinguished on its own. There's a whole discussion about if it's no longer, what if you daven early? Does this apply across the board? Is it because at a certain point historically it was like this and we keep it like that or not? That's a debate. Dekule alma mia. Well, and with this idea, everyone agrees though that shikor asur b'nesiat kapayim, that if you're drunk, you can't do berkat kohanim. Minahane mile. Where do we get this from? Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi mishum bar kapara lama nismecha parashat kohen mivarech leparashat nazir in the Torah. Berkat kohanim, it says this is how you should bless the people, and then it says nazir. So why are these two next to each other? Omar lecha. Nazir asur b'yayin, af kohen mevarech asur b'yayin. Just like the Nazir can't drink wine, the Kohen who's blessing the people can't drink wine. But we're going to have a slew of questions. We're only going to start them today. Matkef lavua de Rabbi Zereva Amrle Oshai Bar Zavda. One of them asked, "Ima Nazir asur b'chartzan, af kohen asur b'chartzan." So kohen mevarech asur b'chartzan. So the Nazir, if we're going to compare them, well, let's compare them entirely. If the Nazir can't eat grapes, maybe a Kohen who's blessing the people can't eat grapes. Okay, seems a little bit strange. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Kral Lisharto Ulevarech Bishmo. Ma Misharet Mutar B'Chartzan, Af Kohen Mutar B'Chartzan. In Sefer Dvarim, it talks about Shevet Levi. You've been designated to serve me and to bless the people. So there's a connection between serving and blessing. Now, serving, we already know. It says Yain v'Shechar al Tesh. When you're serving in the temple, you can't drink wine, but you can't eat grapes. Nobody says you can't eat grapes. So since we compare Lisharto Ulevarech Bishmo, those two must have the same. So therefore, they learn from Nazir just the part that's similar to them doing the avodah. So really what they're trying to say is this issue that's forbidden when they do the work in the temple is also forbidden when they do Birkat Kohanim. Where do we learn it from? Well, we derive it from this connection to the Nazir. But then we're only going to derive it when things that are relevant, right, that are connected with service in the temple. As I said, we're going to have more questions on this tomorrow. So we'll finish up with this topic tomorrow and move on. Have a great day, everybody. And don't forget to register for the Shiur.